The idea that the unconscious rules reality, proposed by Sigmund Freud, is one of the most influential concepts in psychology and fundamentally reshaped our understanding of the human mind. Freud argued that much of what truly drives us is hidden beneath the surface of conscious awareness. He likened the mind to an iceberg. Our conscious thoughts float above the surface, while below lies the vast, unseen unconscious, containing forgotten memories, suppressed desires, unresolved fears, and inner conflicts. These hidden forces shape our behavior even when we are unaware of their influence. Freud's insight came not just from theory but from observation. He noticed, for example, that a person might fear water without realizing it stemmed from a forgotten childhood trauma, or that someone might lash out in anger without understanding it was triggered by something buried deep in their past. This idea transformed how we see ourselves, revealing that we are not entirely rational beings in full control of our decisions, but complex and layered, shaped by forces we cannot always name. The unconscious is not a passive storage space. It is an active force that drives personality, influences relationships, and reveals itself even in dreams. Freud's theory laid the groundwork for modern therapy, inspiring later psychologists to expand, revise, or challenge his ideas. Yet the central truth remains. Much of our behavior operates beyond our conscious control, and to truly understand ourselves, we must look inward, not only at what we know, but also at what we have forgotten. This was more than a theory. It was a revolutionary new way of understanding what it means to be human. We often assume empathy is something natural. When someone stubs their toe and you wince, or when a friend's voice cracks and you feel their pain, it seems instinctive. But psychologists like Paul Bloom argue that empathy isn't automatic. While humans are capable of it, we don't extend it equally to everyone. Our brains are wired to care more about those close to us, family, friends, or people who look and think like us. This selective empathy means we might feel deeply for one person we identify with, yet remain emotionally distant from the struggles of those we don't know or relate to. This bias isn't just personal. It reflects how the brain prioritizes information. In group settings, empathy often flows toward those we see as us rather than them. That's why we can be moved by one vivid story of suffering, but feel detached from large-scale tragedies that are harder to visualize. Empathy also competes with other demands on our mind. When we're stressed, distracted, or focused on our own problems, our ability to tune in to others' emotions drops. Feeling with someone else often requires deliberate effort, slowing down, paying attention, suspending judgment, and actively imagining their perspective. These are skills, not reflexes, and like any skill, they grow stronger with practice. Recognizing that empathy isn't automatic helps explain why we sometimes fail to care when it matters most, and why building a truly compassionate society takes more than good intentions. It requires awareness, effort, and a willingness to push beyond our natural biases. You might excel at trivia but freeze on a tricky puzzle, or breeze through a logic challenge yet forget a fact you once knew. This contrast reveals two distinct forms of intelligence, fluid and crystallized. Psychologist Raymond Cattell introduced this idea to explain why people perform differently on various mental tasks. Fluid intelligence is your ability to think quickly, reason through problems, and adapt to unfamiliar situations. It's not about what you already know, it's your raw mental processing power. You use it when spotting patterns, solving new puzzles, or thinking on your feet in a debate. Crystallized intelligence, by contrast, is built from everything you've learned over time: facts, vocabulary, skills, and general knowledge gained through education and experience. Remembering a historical date, applying a math formula, or using precise grammar are all examples of crystallized intelligence in action. These two forms develop differently. Fluid intelligence typically peaks in early adulthood and gradually declines with age, while crystallized intelligence can keep growing throughout life as long as you continue learning and engaging with the world. Together, they form a fuller picture of human cognition. One person might not excel at abstract puzzles, but possess deep expertise in a particular field. Another might quickly detect patterns yet struggle to recall specific facts. This model shows why measuring only one type of intelligence can give a skewed view. True cognitive strength comes from the balance between both, the agility to solve new problems and the accumulated wisdom to apply what you've learned. We often think of ourselves as having a fixed, unchanging core identity, but psychological research tells a different story. The self is a narrative we continually shape as we live. Psychologist Dan McAdams developed this idea through his work on narrative identity, arguing that people create a sense of self by weaving together a personal story that links their past, present, and imagined future. This story gives life coherence and meaning, but it's not set in stone. It's constantly revised, reframed, and updated as new experiences unfold. We don't remember every moment. We highlight certain events, leave others out, and reinterpret the past based on where we are now. A past failure that once felt like a dead end might later become a turning point in a tale of resilience, and a quiet childhood could be remembered as either lonely or peaceful, depending on the perspective we adopt. This narrative is rooted in real events, yet it is selective, shaped by emotion, context, and memory. Because stories are also social, we often adapt them to fit what others expect or to align with the image we want of ourselves. Seeing the self as a narrative helps explain personal change, whether through therapy, recovery from trauma, or simply growing older, because what shifts is not just behavior, but the way we tell our story. Someone might recast themselves from victim to survivor, from outsider to leader. Research on narrative identity shows that people with coherent, hopeful life stories tend to experience greater well-being, suggesting that the way we shape our personal narrative plays a powerful role in how we live and how we see ourselves. Some people care deeply, strive to do right, and yet find themselves weighed down by a sadness they can't explain. Psychologist Dorothy Rowe noticed this pattern in her work with depression and offered a striking insight. Often, it's good people who suffer most. Rowe didn't mean that everyone with depression is morally superior. Instead, she observed that many who struggle share certain traits. They hold themselves to high standards, want to meet expectations, and feel responsible for others' well-being. When life doesn't go as planned or they fall short of their own ideals, the gap between what is and what should be can cause deep emotional pain. In Rowe's view, depression often arises not from actual failure, but from the belief that failure is unacceptable. People may take responsibility for things beyond their control, feel guilty for not being endlessly strong, or believe they must continually prove their worth. This internal pressure can make even small mistakes feel devastating. Rest feels like laziness. Asking for help feels like weakness, and being anything less than perfect feels like failure. Over time, such rigid beliefs can lock a person into cycles of self-blame and hopelessness. Rowe's insight shifted the discussion around depression, showing that it's not always rooted in trauma or biology. It can also grow from the very qualities that make someone compassionate, responsible, and committed to doing what's right. Seen this way, depression isn't a sign of weakness, but the emotional toll of impossible self-expectations. Healing begins by loosening those rules, allowing space for rest, imperfection, and self-acceptance. As children, we look to others to define who we are: a parent's smile, a teacher's compliment, a friend's laughter. These reactions shape how we see ourselves. Psychologists have long noted a pattern. Self-esteem begins by depending heavily on others' approval, until it doesn't. In early life, self-worth is largely social. Praise makes children feel capable. Criticism or neglect can leave them feeling uncertain or unseen. This dynamic continues into adolescence, when peer approval can matter more than any personal belief. But as people mature, many experience a shift toward what's called internalized self-worth. At this stage, confidence is less tied to outside opinion and more grounded in personal values, identity, and lived experience. A person begins to feel worthy not just because they're liked, but because they know their own strengths, even when no one is watching. This change isn't guaranteed. Some adults remain dependent on external validation, seeking constant reassurance through praise, social media, or approval. Others, often through reflection, challenges, or life transitions, learn to separate their self-esteem from others' perceptions. This marks the beginning of a self-authored identity, a sense of worth built from the inside out. Carl Rogers emphasized the importance of unconditional positive regard in early life, but also noted that lasting self-esteem comes from congruence, when the way you see yourself aligns with the way you live. Understanding this progression highlights why early relationships matter, but also why personal growth must go beyond them. The journey from needing approval to owning your worth is a core part of psychological maturity. And while no one becomes completely immune to others' opinions, healthy self-esteem is something you carry within yourself, not something handed to you. Personality may feel like something we carry within us, but it truly comes alive in a social context. Psychologist Gordon Allport emphasized that while a person alone on an island might still have thoughts, preferences, and habits, personality is most meaningfully expressed through interaction with others. We tend to think of traits, introverted or extroverted, kind or cold, patient or impulsive, as fixed qualities, yet they reveal themselves in relationships and behaviors shaped by culture and shaped further by how others respond. Generosity, for example, isn't visible in isolation. It appears when someone gives, shares, or offers support. The way we act at work, with friends, or among strangers might look like different personalities, but they're simply different expressions of the same self in different environments. From early childhood, feedback from others, encouragement, criticism, affection, or rejection helps shape our traits, values, and beliefs, many of which we absorb from our social groups. This doesn't mean personality is fake or endlessly shifting. It means it's dynamic, evolving as we express, adapt, and refine it through our relationships. Understanding personality as context-dependent explains why we behave differently in various roles and reminds us that who we are isn't just inside us. It's also created in the spaces between us. You might leave the place, in the relationship, or push through the pain, yet your body still reacts. A sudden noise, a certain smell, a crowded room can trigger it. That's because the body holds onto trauma, often speaking before you have any conscious awareness of it. Psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk helped popularize this understanding, showing that trauma isn't only psychological, it's also physiological. After a traumatic event, the brain doesn't simply store it as a memory, it imprints it on the nervous system. Muscles stay tense, breathing remains shallow, and the body acts as though the danger never truly ended. This is why trauma survivors can face physical symptoms, chronic pain, panic attacks, digestive issues, even when they aren't actively thinking about the past. These reactions are automatic, rooted in survival mechanisms designed to protect us. But when those systems stay on high alert long after the threat has passed, they can disrupt everyday life. That's why recovery can't rely on thinking alone. You can't reason your way out of a body that still feels unsafe. While traditional talk therapy helps, it's often only part of the process. Breath regulation, grounding movements, and reintroducing safe touch are examples of how the body can begin to unlearn fear. This reframes how we see trauma. It's not just in the mind, and healing isn't just about words. It's about rebuilding physical safety, one signal at a time. For many, the path forward begins not with memory, but with sensation, not with what they recall, but with what their body has never let go of. When someone experiences a mental health crisis, the instinct is often to see it as a collapse, a loss of stability, reason, or control. But psychologist R.D. Laing offered a different lens. What appears as breakdown may, in some cases, be the start of a breakthrough. Working with people diagnosed with schizophrenia and other severe mental health conditions, Laing was struck not only by their symptoms, but by the deeper meaning beneath them. He proposed that, for some, a psychological crisis isn't a random malfunction. It can be an intense response to trauma, isolation, or inner conflict that can no longer be contained by ordinary coping. In his view, episodes of psychosis, though frightening and disorienting, can sometimes mark a search for identity, meaning, or healing. The mind might pass through chaos not just to fall apart, but to reorganize itself. Rather than simply losing touch with reality, a person may be stepping away from a reality that has already stopped making sense. For instance, someone raised in an emotionally rigid or abusive environment might eventually reject the rules of that world. That rejection could manifest as withdrawal, delusions, or erratic behavior, signs society sees as breakdown. But Laing saw in them a possible attempt to escape false roles and move toward a truer self. He didn't glorify mental illness or ignore its dangers. Instead, he argued that the way society often responds, through judgment, over-medication, or coercion can deepen the crisis. Lang called for empathy, patience, and space for people to work through their inner worlds. His perspective shifted the conversation about mental illness from something to suppress to, at times, something to understand. Sometimes we share an article without reading it fully. It feels like staying informed, but is it about understanding or about looking informed? Psychologist Serge Moscovici offered a sharp observation. The goal is often not to advance knowledge, but to be in the know. His research on how ideas spread showed that information usually moves through conversations, media, and social networks, not academic journals or classrooms. Once people know just enough to talk about a topic with confidence, they often stop questioning or digging deeper. The priority isn't mastery, it's belonging. This is less about laziness than about social connection. Being in the know offers a sense of identity, relevance, and even status. Whether it's politics, health, or pop culture, having something to say signals that you're part of the conversation. For example, someone might repeat a claim about nutrition or climate change without fully grasping the research, not to deceive, but to remain engaged in fast-moving discussions. Moscovici's work helped distinguish between two processes: the transmission of knowledge and the creation of social representations. Facts rarely circulate in their raw form. They're simplified, reframed, and woven into cultural narratives that meet emotional needs. This shift from truth-seeking to social signaling explains why misinformation spreads easily, why public opinion can solidify quickly, and why it's so hard to correct a false belief once it feels socially anchored. The psychology of being in the know shows that what people share and believe is often less about accuracy and more about connection. Suffering is part of life, whether it comes through illness, loss, failure, or the slow weight of disappointment. But psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl believed that avoiding suffering wasn't the most important goal. Far more powerful, he argued, was finding a reason to endure it. Frankl developed logotherapy, a therapeutic approach based on the idea that our deepest drive isn't pleasure or power, but meaning. In the most extreme conditions, even in concentration camps, he noticed that those who could connect their pain to a sense of purpose were more likely to survive and maintain psychological resilience. His central insight was this: suffering stops feeling like suffering the moment it becomes meaningful. This doesn't mean pain disappears. It means its emotional weight changes when it's linked to something larger, understandable, or purposeful. A parent staying up night after night with a sick child still feels exhaustion and strain, but that hardship is anchored in love and responsibility, not random misery. The suffering is real, yet it makes sense. For Frankl, meaning mattered more than happiness. When life feels meaningless, even small frustrations can be crushing. But when people believe their struggles serve something they value, raising a child, building something enduring, helping others, they can often bear more than they thought possible. Logotherapy encourages asking, what is my suffering pointing toward? What cause, value, or belief is worth this pain? Frankl didn't offer false comfort. He offered a challenge. Even in the darkest moments, you can choose how to relate to your suffering. In that choice lies the possibility of reclaiming a sense of purpose. When we think about mental illness, it's easy to imagine it as something happening only inside the mind: chemical imbalances, distorted thinking, or emotional dysfunction. But psychologists and psychiatrists now recognize a wider truth. Mental illness is also profoundly social. While brain chemistry and genetics matter, mental health is shaped just as much by environment, life experience, relationships, and access to basic needs. Someone living with anxiety or depression isn't necessarily battling an internal defect. They may be reacting to very real external pressures like financial strain, trauma, isolation, or discrimination. Take chronic poverty, for example. The constant uncertainty about food, housing, or safety creates a state of ongoing stress. Over time, the body adapts, often by staying on high alert or emotionally shutting down. Patterns that can resemble anxiety, depression, or mood disorders. Trauma works in similar ways. Experiences of abuse, violence, or loss can rewire how the brain processes danger, memory, and emotion. These changes aren't imaginary. They're the body's natural responses to overwhelming events. Mental illness also shows up in the body. Depression can bring fatigue, physical pain, disrupted sleep, and changes in appetite. The mind and body are in constant dialogue, so what affects one inevitably shapes the other. This broader perspective has inspired more holistic treatments, pairing therapy and medication with community support, stress reduction, and lifestyle changes. It also challenges the stigma that mental illness reflects weakness or personal failure. Recognizing that mental illness is not just a brain problem, but a whole person experience opens the door to more compassionate, effective care. It reminds us that sometimes healing the mind begins with transforming the world around it. You land the promotion, the apartment, the recognition you've been chasing, and for a while, it feels like everything has fallen into place. But the feeling fades and life moves on. That's because, as psychologist Carl Rogers emphasized, satisfaction isn't a final destination. A good life is a process, not a fixed state. A key figure in humanistic psychology, Rogers focused on growth, authenticity, and personal potential. He argued that mental health isn't about perfecting yourself or locking in a permanent version of happiness. It's about staying open to change. A fulfilling life isn't something you achieve once and for all. It's something you continually create. This perspective challenged the idea that happiness comes from reaching a stable, ideal state. Instead, Rogers saw thriving as the result of constant adaptation, learning, and engagement with new experiences. In his therapy work, he prioritized creating a space where clients felt fully accepted, which encouraged them to question old assumptions, experiment with new ways of living, and move closer to who they wanted to be. Rogers called this ongoing process self-actualization, not a one-time milestone, but a lifelong journey toward deeper self-understanding and expression. For example, someone might begin therapy feeling trapped in an outdated role, only to realize over time that their values, relationships, or goals have shifted. Living the good life, in that case, would mean embracing that realization and using it to make meaningful changes. For Rogers, psychological well-being came down to a willingness to stay flexible, curious, and engage with life as it unfolds, a readiness to keep evolving rather than trying to arrive. A plant turns toward sunlight. A worm recoils from heat. Even the simplest organisms seem to respond meaningfully to the world around them. This observation led early psychologist Wilhelm Wundt, often called the father of experimental psychology, to a bold conclusion. Mental life doesn't begin with humans, it begins with life itself. In the late 1800s, Wundt proposed that the beginnings of mental life date from the beginnings of life. He didn't mean that bacteria think or feel like humans. Rather, he believed that even the most basic organisms have some form of internal experience, reacting, adapting, and changing in ways that suggest a primitive kind of processing, not just random motion. This view challenged the idea that psychology should only study human thought or advanced brain function. Wundt argued the field should span the full range of living beings, from the simplest life forms to the most complex. That's why his research included not only conscious thought, but also sensations, reflexes, and measurable reactions in a lab. Through controlled experiments on how people respond to sights, sounds, and other stimuli, Wundt worked to show something bigger. Mental activity isn't a late addition to life. It's woven into the very nature of being alive. Even a single-celled organism, he argued, shows traces of a primitive mental structure in how it navigates its environment. This perspective helped establish modern psychology's bridge between biology and experience, suggesting that to understand the mind, we don't have to start with humans, we can start with life itself. Before we learn to speak, argue, or solve problems, we first learn how to exist within a family. From how conflict is handled to how love is expressed, these early experiences leave lasting imprints on how we function throughout life. That's why family therapist Virginia Satter described the family as the factory where people are made. Satter saw families not simply as groups of related individuals, but as interconnected systems. Within these systems, patterns repeat, roles are assigned, and both spoken and unspoken rules shape how each person thinks, feels, and behaves. The family environment doesn't just influence behavior, it helps build a person's very sense of identity. For instance, a child growing up in a home where emotions are brushed aside might learn to suppress feelings to keep the peace. Another raised in a perfection-driven household might come to link self-worth entirely to achievement. These lessons aren't typically taught outright. They're absorbed through everyday interactions. Satter emphasized communication as a central factor. In struggling families, she observed, the problem often lay less in the people themselves and more in how they communicated. Mixed messages, unspoken expectations, and emotional distance could all distort relationships and self-perception. Her therapeutic approach sought to open dialogue, clarify roles, and rebuild genuine connection. She also noted that families pass down more than genetics. They transmit emotional habits, how to handle stress, how to trust, and how to show love. Changing these patterns often means looking back, recognizing what we've inherited, and choosing to do things differently. By calling the family a factory, Satter wasn't criticizing. She was underscoring its influence. Families are powerful environments where psychological blueprints are drawn, and the sooner we understand that shaping, the more freedom we have to grow beyond it. You can follow every rule, meet every expectation, and still feel an emptiness. That feeling isn't always about failure. It can come from living as someone you're not. This is at the heart of a powerful idea. Be that self which one truly is. The phrase comes from Soren Kierkegaard, a 19th-century philosopher who helped lay the foundation for existential psychology. He argued that many people live out of step with their real selves, not out of deliberate deception, but because they've adopted versions of themselves shaped by others' expectations. They chase who they should be, rather than who they truly are. Kierkegaard called the result despair, not sadness or fear, but a deeper disconnection from one's authentic self. For instance, someone might devote their life to a career they don't care about to satisfy family expectations. Even if they succeed, they might feel an unshakable sense of loss, the life of the person they never became. The way forward, he believed, wasn't reckless rebellion but honest recognition. It meant facing that gap between the real self and the performed self, and then choosing to live in alignment with one's true identity, even if that path feels uncertain. Modern psychology reflects this view. Carl Rogers' person-centered therapy and the humanistic concept of self-actualization both place authenticity at the core of well-being. Kierkegaard wasn't offering a shortcut. He was pointing to a lifelong journey of aligning actions with values, becoming, step by step, the person you already are beneath it all. Movement can feel instinctive, as if the body simply knows what to do. But hidden between muscle and motion is a spark of thought, and centuries ago, one philosopher tried to locate its source. René Descartes proposed that within the body's machinery lived a reasoning soul. He saw the body as a biological machine, bones, muscles, and nerves operating under physical laws, while the mind, or soul, was something entirely different, invisible, indivisible, and capable of thought, choice, and reason. The mystery was how these two worlds, one material, one mental, could interact. Descartes suggested the meeting point was a tiny structure in the brain, the pineal gland. He imagined it as the soul's control center, where the mind issued commands to the body. Modern science no longer supports this exact model. The pineal gland doesn't steer our decisions, but Descartes' theory of dualism, separating mind from body, sparked centuries of debate. It pushed scientists and philosophers to probe questions about consciousness, free will, and the biology of thought. Even today, the puzzle remains. How does the brain's physical activity give rise to awareness? Descartes didn't solve it, but he helped frame it, forcing us to ask how a machine like the body can carry something as abstract and limitless as reason. You might laugh at something that isn't all that funny, not because of the punchline, but because of the people you're with. Psychologists and anthropologists now see laughter as far more than a reaction to humor. It's a powerful way humans bond and signal safety. Laughter is one of our most universal behaviors, found in every culture and appearing early in life. Babies laugh before they can speak. Yet research by scientists like Robert Provini shows that most laughter doesn't follow jokes or comedy at all. Instead, it emerges during ordinary conversations, often in response to simple comments or social cues. This points to laughter's deeper role in communication. Shared laughter lowers tension, builds trust, and strengthens group identity. It's a nonverbal way of saying, we're on the same side. From an evolutionary perspective, it likely developed as a signal that the group was safe, with no immediate threats nearby. On a neurological level, laughter triggers the release of endorphins, our brain's natural feel-good chemicals, which foster connection and ease. Its contagious nature helps synchronize mood and behavior, which is why laughing together can break the ice, deepen friendships, and boost team cohesion, even when nothing particularly funny has happened. Laughter also works as a subtle form of communication. We use it to show agreement, smooth over awkward moments, or reinforce social bonds and hierarchies. People tend to laugh more when others around them do, especially if they admire or want to connect with someone in the group. Seen this way, laughter isn't just a spontaneous reaction, it's social glue. It's a tool, a signal of belonging, and the body's way of saying without words, "You're safe here. You belong."